folks, my name's Zombieapple, also known as Sauce Boss, depends on where you follow me, and this is the third part of my three-part video series on shading, or specifically my technique of shading, not shading in general. And for this third part, I am going to be showing you my technique for creating a composited effect, much like you see in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where we'll be trying to make it appear as though there's a cartoon character sitting in this chair here in the real world. Alright then, so this takes a little bit of extra thinking when it comes to figuring out how you're going to put the character in there. It usually depends on what scene it is you're creating. The best idea is to figure out what it is you want to do beforehand. You figure out, I want a character to be sitting in a chair, or maybe I'm standing with them in like a selfie pose or whatever. You have to figure that out, then set up the shot. You have to know what you want it to look like in the end, and then start out and then do it. So what we're going to do to start off is we're going to kind of figure out the general perspective. We're going to have to make a character fit in the perspective that matches this world, so it might take a little bit of work. One of the things that I found helps me is drawing perhaps some guidelines. Well, that's not very good. First, I think I'm going to just turn this down like we did in the last video, where I lowered the opacity of the line art layer. Okay, and now we're going to go into here. Okay, so let's pick a random color and we're going to figure out the perspective. So let's find some good reference lines. For those of you who understand perspective, that's good, then you probably understand what we're doing. For those who don't, I would say stop the video here and go look up different perspectives, like 3-point perspective, 1-point perspective, and how it works. More or less, we're just trying to find convergence points as well as just general perspective lines. And even if you can't, like you don't have something like this, it's not really super important. It's just to give us an idea of how this all works in our shot, where the perspective is in our shot. I would more likely just kind of do something like this on the actual surface that our character is going to be on. If we flatten it out and kind of make a grid shape, we get an idea, a better visualization of what the perspective in this room is like. Okay. I did that on the background layer, but that's okay, as long as we can see it. Usually it's good to do this. How do you know which objects to do this with? Well, since this character is going to be sitting in a chair, it's a good idea to have it on the things, have it on the chair. Usually have it on the objects they're interacting with. It helps you give you an idea of form. For example, with this, it's flat, so we have a flat grid. If we come over here to this part of the bed, and maybe we do this, you know, it's not always going to be flat, sometimes it's curved. We want an idea of what the form looks like so that we know how things wrap around. Let's say if they have a hand, we know that it's probably going to lay something like this on the bed. It's not even a conscious thing. It's more of a subconscious thing where you become aware of where all these things, you know, the general space in the room. It's kind of a hard thing to describe. That's why I seem like I'm having a little bit of trouble describing it. It's something you just really have to kind of feel out and just kind of visualize it. and I'm hoping and doing a good job of that. I feel like I am. So let's take let's kind of pick out what character we want to do. I don't know, I guess I'll just start doing one and see where it goes from there. Alright, so what I want to do first is we're not actually going to do very clean cut lines first. We're going to do some sketch lines. So the first thing I want to do is I want to have root the character in something in this world. And since they're sitting in a chair, I'm going to start with where the bottom of the character is going to be, where they're going to sit on down. So that's not exactly the shape of what it's going to be in the final, but it's good for giving us an idea of where they're going to be. So at this point, for all you artists out there, this is really just sketching the character in with a correct perspective. And hopefully a lot of you have a good idea of how to draw in a good enough perspective to do this. Really, this is only part of making it convincing, because what we're doing is we're drawing on top of a picture, and we just need to make it look convincing that it's actually in the same picture. And this is only part of the steps to making it look convincing, is making it seem as though it's fitting in with the environment. And I've seen some examples of, I mean, there's, you know, the very big example, which is Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and that one is very well done compositing. And I've seen some other examples too, but none that are quite as good. One of the things I noticed is they don't really pay attention to having the characters to conform to the scene. Even if they don't really need to, you should probably try, you know, going out of your way to really make it look as though the characters are wrapping around different parts. You know, they've got their hand on the bed like this, they've got their legs going over the chair like this. It helps it make it more convincing. The more that they're interacting within that world, the more it is convincing that they are in that world. So I think I'm gonna just do Cracky Kangaroo, because I can imagine him sitting on this chair with his legs kind of spread out, looking kind of goofy. He's kind of a goofy character. And he's a character that I haven't done one of these with yet. And I think I'll post this afterwards and link the tutorial in it. Okay, so from this point on, it's really just like I said. It's making sure the characters fit the correct proportions. One thing I found that helps with the construction lines is when you're doing the head, is do a horizontal line like this at the level that you want the eyes to be, and then a vertical line like this at the point where you want, at the direction you want the head to be facing. And this really helps with drawing the perspective on the head. I know a lot of people have trouble doing 3/4 and things like that. I found this really helps me. It simplifies the process of getting the perspective on the head down. And then when you do the eyes, you gotta squeeze it in whatever space you've been given in the middle there. But I'll work on it. So I think I'll go into fast forward mode, sketch this character out. Hopefully you get what it is I'm trying to do here. Seeing what I do in fast forward might help you out a little bit more. And I'll come back when we're ready to go to the next step. Okay. So I finished up a rough sketch here, and I cleaned it up a little bit so that you could probably get a better idea of what's going on here. Let me just turn this down a little bit. You can see it a bit better. Maybe not, I don't know. Okay. One thing you'll notice I did is I had him put his hand on the chair here, show he's kind of supporting himself there. Sometimes interaction doesn't just have to be the characters touching something. Sometimes it can be something that overlaps. It's usually easier to do something where the tail is not overlapped by this part of the chair, if you can see that. But although it's easier, it's not convincing. People who want to make this really convincing go that extra step to have things that are overlapped. And if this looks kind of hard, like, how am I going to make a cartoon, but, it's overlapped by something that's behind it. Don't worry, I'm going to show you how to do that. Another interaction I had is he's holding onto the chair here. It doesn't really seem necessary. He could just have his other hand over here. But again, that extra interaction with the scene makes it more convincing. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to ink this. We're going to do the final lines. And I don't think I need to walk you through that. I think you've pretty much gotten that figured out. And also at this point we don't need this part anymore, so we're going to go ahead and delete that layer because now we have our character set up in our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the final lines on Cracky here, and I'll come back when I'm done. Okay, so I've got the final black lines out. You notice he looks a little bit worried. I wasn't going for worried, I just had his eyes pointing up and he kind of came out like this. Also, I usually do vector art and not just simple hand-drawn line art. I usually go in there. I want it to look as clean as possible, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going to do simple line art, and plus it doesn't really look that bad. It's just not as precise and controlled as vector art. I usually use for vector art, I use the pen tool over here. You could probably look up some tutorials on how to use that. I wish I had Illustrator to do my vector art, but I do not have Illustrator, and I don't have the money to get Illustrator, but there's plenty of other programs that let you do that. I know that GIMP has that, and it also has like an auto smoothing for your brush, kind of like how Flash does. Anyways, so I'm just going to finish putting this in here, and the next step is going to be adding in all the flats. So again, we're kind of following the same pattern here. We have a sketch, we go over it with our black lines, then we fill in the flats, and then we're going to do the shading. The shading is going to probably be the next important part where I'm really going to work. I'm really going to give you guys a better description, because that's the part where it comes in making it look really convincing. That's the other part that makes it look convincing that it is this character in this scene. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that, and I'll be right back. Also, one more thing, we're not going to need these blue lines from now on, so we'll get rid of those too. Okay, and I'll fast forward now. I've got all the flat colors in there now. So now what we're going to do is, if you know what we're going to do, you know that we're going to move on to the shading. First I'm just going to take a look at this, and we're going to bring this back up to full opacity and see how that looks so far. So it doesn't look super convincing. It looks partially convincing because right now it's just kind of, you know, there's no matching coloring or shading, but it does look like, you know, it's starting to get there. We're starting to see that he does in fact sit on the seat and his form starts to make sense. So you're probably worried about these little parts over here, like this is overlapping and this is, you know, this isn't the correct thing. That's going to be our final step. Once we've drawn this character, colored him and shaded him, and he's done, that's all we need to do, then we're going to go back here and we're going to cut that out. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, shading. It's just something I want to say about that is I actually did a little bit of research on how compositing is done or was done in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And one of the secrets that they use, which is one of the things that I use specifically for shading, where I got that idea of doing it separately, doing you know, your shadows on a separate layer and also erasing it, is the way they did their effect. You know, after they drew it, the way they got the shading to match the environment, or at least what helped them do it, because it seems like very complicated. You've got to think of all the light sources, like the window over here and the light that I actually have over here. It seems kind of complicated to have to keep track of all those things. What helped them, and what they did, is they actually had completely separate animation cells for different layers. The first layer was blocked out colors like this and the line art, and they had a separate layer, a separate animation cell that was just transparent except for all the shadows. So they had one person who just filled in the color for the character, and that's all they did, and that's all they had to worry about, was making sure the character had the correct color. Another person whose job it was to do the shadows, and that's all they had to worry about. All they had to worry about is say, hey, where are the light sources, so where does that mean where the shadows are? And that's all they had to worry about, was just making sure the shadows were in the right place. And then the last person was doing the highlights. And one of the interesting thing about how they did the highlights is the animation cell, which is a piece of clear plastic, it's one of the frames, is they actually cut out a hole. They like colored in where they wanted the highlights to be, and then they cut that part out of the film, so that when they took the picture of that frame, it's sitting on a light board, which means a light is shining through it, that it would just purely be that light plus whatever color filter they put in there shining through it. And so what's the reason for that? Why did they have light coming through it, coming through the character? Why did they cut a hole out of it to have colored light coming through? Why didn't they just paint on the highlights like we do? Well, because it made it more realistic, because highlights are just light reflecting. So when they cut a hole in it, that light coming through had a sort of glowing, soft glowing effect to kind of create the illusion that it was bouncing off of this character, which is another thing that had them, you know, that made it seem as though as it was interacting with the physical world around it, as there was light actually reflecting off of this character. So we're not going to be doing that, obviously, because we're not using a light board or any actual film cells, but we can still, you know, create that effect of the soft glow. Another way I just thought of to have your characters interact is not just making contact with objects, but also like a good list of things is making contacts with objects, grabbing something, maybe putting their hand on something they're sitting on, having their legs and body conform to the thing they're sitting on, interacting with a person, looking at a person, having their face or eyes directed towards an object of focus. These are all different things that can make it seem like your character is interacting with the environment. So when you go to do a picture of maybe they're talking to a person, maybe you can have their arm around that person that they're looking at or that they're with, or looking at them or looking at the camera. Again, it's all part of planning and just knowing what ways you can make the character interact with the environment. Okay, so the first step is, I'm done talking about that. The first step is we're going to get our layer here, we're going to bring it down, the opacity down a bit. We're going to get our dark blue and full opacity brush. We're going to color our dark blue over this. Now, hold on a second. I'm going to stop really quick. The whole reason we put down this blue is we want it to be like the darkest shadow that we have. We want to start off coloring it with the darkest shadow that we have in the area. But in this case, we don't have to guess. We don't just have to make it up. We have an environment already. We have shadows like you can see on the sheet over here and under here. So we can actually sample something from the environment. Now that's solid black because that's all the way under there. But he's not under there. He's up here. So we want to take the darkest shadow we have that's kind of, you know, in this general area. And I think a good place to, and usually a good idea is to choose something that's white, because that's just like the very basic thing. So we could probably choose something like this, or like that. Maybe something like this. Let's choose the one off of the bed since it's blue already. And then that is our shadow sample. So now we're going to go over this and we're going to darken the whole thing. Okay, so knowing where to take the shadows off, you're probably going to have to consider these parts, because like I said, we're going to figure that out later, but for right now you need to know how to color it so it's going to work correctly with the scene later. Because what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to cut this out. We're actually going to turn this layer off, hold on, this one, and we're going to select our this part of our chair here, the part that's overlapping it, and then we're going to go back to this layer, the color layer, and we're going to hit delete, and that's going to cut it out right there and make it look like his hand is going behind that. And the same thing we're going to do with the tail. So that means you're going to have to color you're going to have to keep this shaded right here, so that even though when we cut it out it's going to look like it's kind of behind there and that the chair is casting a shadow on his hand. Also, I would say that this color could probably be a little bit darker, just a tiny bit, not a whole heck of a lot. So we're going to go into our brightness and contrast, which is in our image adjustments tab up there, and we're going to turn this down just a bit to about right there. Seems good. Not all the way. Okay, and now we know what to do. And this is what's great, is because we're not just making up a light source. It seems like it would be easier just to make up a light source and just follow this made up light source than it would to have to follow one that is, you know, we have to adhere to strictly, but it actually makes it a lot easier. At least for me, I feel like it makes it a lot easier, because now we don't have to worry about pre-visualizing a made up light source. We have it there. So one of our sources here is the window. Now when it comes to things like windows, especially when they have blinds closed, there's going to be light coming out of it, but not a lot. Because you can see here on the bed that there's not a lot of light hitting it. This isn't like really lit up. And the other light is a floor lamp I have over here. So you can see that there's like some of the light from the floor lamp hitting this, some of it from the window. So what this means is I think most of our light, our highlights, is going to be focusing on this off-screen thing over here. And some of it, just very softly, is going to be this. So why don't we do it so that our main light source is the floor lamp, and then we'll do some of that underlighting technique where we just do the very edges over here. So for this picture you probably can't see this, but I know where it is relative to this, and when you do your picture, hopefully you'll be using a picture that you took yourself, or that you at least know where the lighting is, even if it's off screen. Sometimes that's actually another thing that makes it more convincing. If you can see the light source in the screen that's being projected onto the character, that's also another thing that makes it more convincing. I guess I didn't really do it with this one, but that's okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on just the yellow source right now, and we're going to worry about this one later. Okay, so we start off with like the biggest objects. We're going to start off with just the whole body on its own. And let's bring our opacity down pretty low, somewhere around there, like even below 20. And we're going to bring this brush way up. And if our light source is coming from over here, that means we're going to leave this edge mostly dark. So let's get it like that. And then we're going to do the whole head. And then the body, and then this arm in general, and this hand, I guess, a little bit of this tail. You're actually going to want, even though this tail is further back, you want to unshade the tip of it, because this is the part that's being covered by the body. This part's sticking out. Like in the first one, we talked about how this shadow is sticking out more out here, so it's less dark. Things that are sticking out further away from crevices and parts of the body are the parts that are going to be lighter. Okay, so we're starting to get there. You kind of get this feeling at this point. You can kind of start to see this starting to take shape. Like even at this point, we're not even near done, but you can start to get a feeling of, yeah, his head does look like it's kind of there. You know, his body does look like it's kind of sitting on that seat. This does look like the proper amount of shading. It looks like he looks like he's there, he's just not getting any light. So we're going to just keep working on that. Again, we're going to go into the more detailed area. We're going to get closer so we can detail it more. And, you know, this is more of just the same of what we learned in that last one, where we applied it to characters. Except now we have, like, physical light sources. And how much you unshade it, you know, how much you leave dark and how light you make it also really depends on how intense the light source is. Like this one, this is going to be our primary light source, but it doesn't mean it's like really super bright. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to like treat it like it's really super bright for right now. And when we do that step where we go back and we add some shadows back in, we're going to go back over to make sure it's the proper amount of intensity. Okay, so this is probably just, we need a higher opacity on our brush here. So because he's so close to this, I'm not worried about whittling it away little by little. I'm just going to go right for it. So remember, our light source is coming from here, coming down like that. So we just keep that in mind. Keep in mind where it's going to be hitting the most, where it's going to be hitting first on our character, and just follow that. Just follow that. Just again, it's that combination of does it look right, also compared to, you know, is it technically accurate given where the lighting is and where the character is and the shape of the character. And again, this is the fact that you have a physical environment to refer to, that you have your background picture, and I really would recommend having your background picture on in full opacity once you get to the flat, you know, you've gotten the flat colors done, because it really like gives you a sense when you kind of like zoom back like this, you really get a sense of, you know, does he look like he fits in this room, and if not, what looks wrong? Is it this part over here? Does it look like it's too bright on his face, not bright enough? And then you just keep going. You just keep working at it, making sure you're referring to the light source, just taking a step back every now and then to like make sure that every step of the way your character looks like he or she should be in that scene. And since from this point until we go to our next step is just more of what I taught you, and I've already kind of gone on about it. This is just more of the doing shading in the correct way, and we've already gone on with that in the other video. then I'm just going to fast forward here until I'm done with this step where I'm doing the initial erasing, and I'll come back. Okay, so it looks like the initial erasing has been done, and let's go ahead and take a look at this again. Okay, it's starting to look like, you know, there's actually some form to this character, like they could actually be in this environment, but it's still not quite right, and that's because we still have to do our other shading, where we add some shadows back and then add some highlights back again. So let's go ahead and start doing that. So for this, it's more the same, but again, we are taking a look at where it is we're actually affecting. You know, we're taking a look at the overall lighting in this. The light's coming this way, so it makes sense that the... Hold on. Okay, it makes sense that it'll be under the nose, but slightly more out in this direction. We're going to do our initial like detailed shading first, and then we're going to go back and do the sort of overall looking shadows to make it darker where it needs to be darker. And before we do that actual like making it darker, looking darker, once you finish the more detailed areas, like we're doing right now, where you do like the brows and the smaller crevices and such, take a step back before you go into doing larger areas and making sure that, you know, everything isn't too bright. Like really zoom back, because you'll find it's a lot easier to see if you see the whole scene overall, to get an idea of what needs to be darker and what needs to be lighter. Okay, so we're going to go back to this. The thing is, when you overlap it, you don't have to do all the same areas again. As long as it's like, you know, I did this area and not this area, like I went over this area with shadow and not this area, I can add a whole layer over and over again to this, and there will always be that difference of this part and this part. So if you want to keep like a shadow there like that, but you just want to make this whole overall area darker, then that's how you would do that. Is you would start off by just putting in the more detailed, more precise line of where you want that contrast to be, and that's what we're going to be doing here. Is I'm just putting in that, and then later I'm going to go over and make it a little bit darker. So I'm going to work on this. I'm guessing you guys probably know where to go with this from here, and I'll come back when I'm ready to do the more overall darkening of this. So I'll see you then. So I went over and did that, and one thing I noticed is sometimes it may not seem as dark as it's supposed to be. Like even if you're getting like all the way where you've gone over like many times, and it's still not you've gotten to 100% darkness and it's still not as dark as you want it to be. I was going to say you can go over it with a darker blue, but since the whole reason it's as light as it is because of the opacity, we can just move that up a bit. Like if you find that after you've done this that your shadows aren't as dark as they're supposed to be, you can move this back up, and then those shadows are a little bit more emphasized. Sometimes it's maybe even good to like go all the way and like really make them dark, because you can always erase it again later, and really just find out the areas where there needs to be highlights and then adjust the darkness of the shadows by moving this little slider. So that's kind of what we've done here. We figured out where we want our shadows to be and such. And I'm just going to go back over one more time with this eraser. Just really quick here, I'm just going to work out some of the spots that I think could be better highlighted. And once I'm done with that, we're going to go over and we're going to do that, we're going to do the overall darkness. So just one more second here. I'm going to finish this up. Okay. Now we're going to take this and we're going to make it really low opacity, and we're going to just see where it is that we think this needs to be a little bit darker. It's very subtle, which is why we set to such a low opacity, but this is just slightly too bright. You can kind of see that everything's a little more yellowed, everything's a little bit darker. When you look at the reflection of this chair and the highlights on it, it's not getting a very intense thing. It's not exactly this intense. And since shadows are the only thing we have a slider for, we're just going to make those a little bit darker. So I'm going to go over this whole thing just once with this and see what kind of change that makes. It's not very noticeable, so we're going to just keep going over it, really emphasizing the darker areas. Crevices like in between his arm here, right where his hand is, by his legs, bottom of his shirt, by his tail, this other hand would probably be covered up by that. So now it's looking darker, closer to what we want. And we're just going to get it very light. And this is really it. When you get into something more complex, like the last time I said I wasn't making it very complex, but when you get something complex like this, you're just kind of going back and forth and applying and erasing until it looks right. But each time you go back and do one or the other, you're doing a little bit less each time. So that lighting is pretty close. I'm going to say that we work on, hold on, I'm going to say that we work on his face a little bit more, and that's probably the spot we're going to be looking at the most. Just erase it a little bit more. His eyes probably get better reflection. Whoa, hey now. That is not the right layer. What is going on with me today? Eyes reflect a little bit more. Okay, it's probably his cheeks, like this. Bridge of his nose, in the front of his head, something like that. Okay, so we're going to do it like that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to do those little underlighting highlights. So that means we're going to do, actually here's what we're going to do. Before we're going to do underlighting highlights for this source, but what I think is we're going to come back and we're actually going to draw on those with a soft brush we're going to draw around the edge, or maybe use an inner shadow, which is a quick way of doing that. So for right now, we are going to just do the underlying shadows for where, this particular area. The surfaces that he's rested on. First thing I want to do, though, is... Actually, you know what, let's just do that. I'll tell you about the other thing later after we've done this. So, I'm going to pick something that's close to white, but not quite. I'm going to pick yellow, because the light we have is yellow. So, there's going to be a sort of hint of yellow to our texture, and I'm going to go ahead on a new layer, and I'm going to start doing this. And we're going to have that really low opacity, just like that, so we can build it up very slowly and easily. We don't want it to be too intense. It's not. It's just the light of a chair. We're not. It's not a mirror or anything. The back of his shirt like that. If you have a character that's interacting with, say, a person, or even in this situation, it's a good idea. Even though it's very subtle, it's one of the kind of rules of lighting is that colors reflect. Such as if I have a very red shirt, you might see the table has a little bit of a red reflection. The table or desk that I'm sitting by might have a very red kind of reflection, and that's because the color of that shirt is kind of reflecting on it. It's very soft, it's very faint, but it's still there. It's something that you would notice if it wasn't there. You'd be like, well, this looks kind of weird. So one of the other things of giving very photorealistic light is it's making that sort of reflection. So if I have a red shirt and I'm standing next to Cracky, I might have a little bit of hint of red. Or in this case, he's got a yellow shirt, so we might want to go over this chair at some point and give a very soft hint of yellow. And we're also going to have to do the thing that I wanted to do next, but I decided we're going to do this first, is applying shadow to the actual thing. We're going to apply shadow under here, under his legs, and we're probably going to have to work on this part of the chair right here too. But for right now, we're going to just keep working on this underlighting. Get under his lip here. It doesn't need to be super precise because it's very subtle. But again, this adds more to the form. One thing that I found, if you're the kind of person who has trouble figuring out where light goes on a character, how to know where to put a shadow, believe me, I've been there. I was there for such a freaking long time trying to figure out how do I know where to put a shadow. I can do it on a sphere, I can do it, but like photorealistically, where do I put this? One thing that I found that helped me is working in a more 3D medium. If you can work in a CGI program, I would suggest doing that. Work with CGI. If you work with it just a little bit, and the lighting systems they have in their rendering systems, that usually kind of helps you get this idea of like very soft shadows or very soft lights and inside shadows. That helped me a lot. Or if you can't work with that, maybe get some clay and sculpt. I found that sometimes practice isn't like consciously doing something, like consciously making shadows. It's sometimes just being familiar enough with that particular thing helps. It helps a lot just to be familiar with specific things. So if your problem is 3D objects, how to draw things so they seem like they actually have form and they don't just look flat, giving them the proper lighting, that just working with something that's 3D, like molding clay and just making things out of clay, that can really give you an idea, like a natural, very instinctual sense of form and things like that. I found that helped me a lot. So he's looking a little bit better. He looks pretty good. He looks just a bit like he should be there. We're going to keep adding more to this. there's just going to be layers, probably many more layers of adding extra shading, just like a general, like maybe line of shading here. But that's pretty good for this step. So the next step we're going to be doing is we're actually going to do that soft light. And one of the things I want to try is, well, the first thing is I don't think we're going to need to keep the line and color art separate anymore. So what we're going to do is we're going to merge those two together. But we're going to merge everything else in between, which means all the highlights and everything. So let's go ahead and do that. Merge all 4 of those layers. The 4 layers should have been the flat color, the shadows, and the highlights, and then the line art. And the highlights that we just did. Okay, so now we've got them all as one thing. Now what we're going to do is I want to try a little something first. Sometimes this can work. Inner shadow is a neat little filter that, if you can see it, hold on. Yeah, see, there's kind of it creates a shadow on the inside. Now we're not going to use this to create a shadow though, because you can change the color you want, and we're going to change this to a sort of soft white, soft blue kind of light to match what the window is like. Something like that. And we're going to see if that looks any good at all. If we put it over here. And that's what's interesting, is this little thing you can change the angle, like where's the light coming from? It's coming from over here. So it sort of looks like it. Now we've got the position correctly. The light is hitting it in the correct spot. But what we want to do is, it's too intense right now. Look at how far it is. So let's look at where the light that it's affecting, probably around here, the lighting that it's applying to on the covers over here, and we see that it's actually very, very soft. So what we're going to do is we're going to increase size so that it blends a little bit better. How do we want to do distance? Let's do distance like right about here, and then we're just going to decrease the opacity until it seems that it's at a softness level that seems right. That it seems like that it's still there, but just not, you know, as harsh. So, okay. And that looks pretty good. We want to help it along a little bit though, because it's only just getting the edge. For things like the eyes, it's going to reflect a little bit more. And I'm glad that we combined the color art with the line art so that it's actually overlapping the line art. It's making it a little more realistic now. So we're going to go back and we're going to do our little underlighting thing that we're doing, and we're going to do it over here. So you can see that we use this already, but we're going to go even further with it. And that's kind of what makes this a little bit more complex, doing things like this compositing, is because we're going a few extra steps to just keep adding on and on. And one thing I've always found that works best when doing art like this is don't try to do everything you want to do all at once. Do a little bit at a time. Like how we whittle away a little bit of shading at the time, we add a little bit of this lighting at a time. You don't want to overdo it. It can give you an idea of how much further you need to go with it each time. So I am just gonna, it seems a little too intense. Also, it's not on a separate layer. So I'm just gonna go ahead and work on this, and when I'm done, I'll come back, maybe give a further explanation if one is needed. Alright. Okay, so we're back, and one thing you may have noticed is I kind of made it a little too intense, but that's exactly why I put it on a separate layer, because I wanted to block out where it would be, because this is more about the position of where the lighting was hitting and not so much the intensity. The intensity was good when we did that inner shadow effect, but it just wasn't covering as much as it would reasonably. for example, it wasn't really affecting the nose. And even though, like I said, this is really subtle, it's not supposed to be as intense as we're having it right now, um, it's still going to be there. It still needs to be there because if it wasn't, you would notice. It's all part of what makes it mostly realistic, what makes it so realistic. So we're going to just take that layer and we're going to bring it down too. And the nose is pretty intense, so I'm going to use that as a reference to see like how low I should bring it. And that seems about good. So look at that. We look at his head right here, his face, and it kind of feels like this is really like he's getting this light from this yellow light, and he's also getting the light from this blue light. It's always good to have more than one light source, because again, that is one more thing that makes it more convincing, more things that it's interacting with. So I would think there only needs to be a few more adjustments made to this, and then we can go on to some of our final steps, because overall, if you look at this, the coloring, what I mean is like the character itself is looking like it's done. I think everything else now is just applying the shading to the chair, and the other thing I want to do is I actually want to add a noise filter over this character, because he doesn't have the best resolution, but his lines are pretty clean cut compared to the resolution of the picture. You know, when you take a cell phone picture, which this is, it's going to have that kind of resolution. If we want to look like he's in the same place, we need to make it look like he's also in the same picture. So we're going to change his resolution up, and we're going to add a noise filter to make it seem like he's matching the graininess of this filter, of this photo, so that it's the same amount. So this next step, what we're going to do here is I want to try something. I want to give that glowing effect that I was talking about earlier to make it look like some light is reflecting off of him. So we're actually going to go on the layer beneath, and we're going to get a very big soft brush here with a low opacity, and we're going to go to the parts where it seems like it's hitting the most along the edges, like this part of his face right here. And we're going to just very lightly do this so that the very edge of the soft brush is sticking out here, kind of create a glow. And we could do this with drop shadow, but it's going to apply it to everything. I want to be a little more precise with it than that. And again, one of the things that really helps is, even though it doesn't seem like detail that you would really see, it's best to put it in there anyways. Because sometimes there's that stuff that we don't consciously notice that's really helpful, that really kind of sells the illusion, sells the image there. Okay, so now we've kind of made what look like a very soft glow, the light kind of bouncing off. And that might be just a little too intense, so we're going to turn it down and see how that looks, and if it's, you know, not intense enough, we'll turn it back up. So I think that's probably pretty good. Just like look at this one spot right here. Kind of really get a feeling that he's in the same room here. So still, this part right here looks good, but for some reason this doesn't look quite right, because we still have to add shadows down here. Now what I'm going to do with that is there's multiple ways you can do that. You can use dodge, actually, the dodge tool, or what is it? Is it dodge? No, it's actually burn. Dodge actually lightens things. Burn is something you can actually do to make it darker. Like, look at that. I usually like to use a different layer on top of this with maybe some black or blue, something to shade it, to kind of like add more to it. But you know, we go over with the dodge tool, and this is essentially our darkener. And I know a lot of people have used this. I've used it in the past too, but it's just, all this does is really darken. You don't get to control what color it is that you're darkening it with. It's darkening the colors that are already there, and I really just liked And you can't have it on a separate layer either. I really just like to use colors for my shading for the most part. For this, I guess it's alright to use a shadow. So remember, this arm, this body is going up, so we want our shadow to go even, you know, the shadow is being cast by this light, so it's going to go all the way back here on this chair here. And as we get closer to the parts where it's really touching down on the chair, we want it to be darker. Maybe a little bit of a shadow around here. Starting to look a little more realistic now that we've got that going, right? I think I'm going to go back over this again with a little more shadow. Oh. Because his legs look like they're a little too bright. But I don't suppose that's something I would need to include in the tutorial. That's just a minor adjustment. Okay. And then some of the other things we gotta do is we gotta darken this part of the chair, but look at this. We're applying our burn tool, but it's not really doing much. It's probably because this is already so dark, which is exactly another reason of why I like to use this. Now for this, there's a highlight on it because the light is making direct contact. But if we see spots where it's not making direct contact, it's this color. So we're actually gonna do it up like that. We're gonna color over these highlights here. Hold on, I'm gonna bring that to full 100%. Whoa. What if we erase that a bit? Looks like there's a little too much. Okay. So now, although up close it doesn't look fantastic, when we zoom out, it looks as though he's casting a bit of a shadow on that chair, on those parts of the chair at least. Hold on, we're gonna adjust for where we are, go to the darkest part again. So we'll try something. No. Alright. Get back here too. I feel like I made a little bit of a mistake here. Accidentally put this on the same layer as the glowing highlights, which isn't really awful, but it's not the best thing to do either. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish up. Again, this is about placement. It's not always about intensity. So I'm going to finish placing those where I want them. And I'm actually going to cut the shadows, at least most of them, out of the... Hold on a second. Because we want to keep this covered up because they had a highlight. This part we don't. So this part up here, which didn't have a very intense highlight, and this part down here, because we don't want those to be such, you know, we don't want the brush to have such high opacity on those. I actually, just a second ago, tried using a soft light, and that actually looked a lot better. So we're going to cut and paste those in place. That's going to put it on a completely new layer for us. And if we apply soft light, hold on a second, I want to zoom in here and show you that we kind of use this solid dark color here. But when we apply soft light, although it makes it darker, it maintains this, and this seems exactly like what the dodge tool is doing, except we have more control over this. So now that looks pretty good. It might look a little too dark, so I'm just gonna tone it down a little bit, and there we go. That looks pretty nice. Let's see. Another thing I want to do is, let's put this on top of that, is I want to do this shirt. This shirt is yellow, and some of that color is going to reflect on some of the surfaces, like the part of the chair. It's going to be very subtle, like I said before, but we should put it in there. So that looks very intense, but not to worry. We're not going to leave it that intense. This is another one of those parts where it's more about placement than it is about the proper intensity. And don't worry about the shape either, because that's not really going to show up all that much once we lower the opacity. So that's pretty good for replacement. It's just kind of diffused around this general area. So we're going to really put soft light, maybe not, maybe something like overlay. Actually, you know what? We want to still decrease the opacity enough that we can't really see it that much. So let's put it at hard light, and then we're going to bring this down a lot. There we go, like 18%. So you can't really see it that much anymore. If you zoom in, you can see a sort of yellowish tint. Let's bring it down even more. Again, this is another one of those things where it's interacting with the environment around it. So now you can barely see it, but it's still there. We've got a hint of it. Okay, so I think this is good for the character. There's just a couple more things we have to do. I think we can merge all this together. Let's see. Okay, so I think we can merge the shadows and such together. Okay, we're going to merge everything that's not the background layer together. Now here's what we're going to do. We're going to take that out, and we're going to come over to our polygonal lasso tool, and it's a good thing this is straight because it means we don't have to do a lot of clicking. And we're going to bring it right along the edge here. And we're going to come in a little bit. We're not going to stick it outside the edge of the chair, this part of the chair. We're going to actually bring it in a little bit so that it doesn't look like there's a gap between this chair and his hand, so that it really looks like he's clutching around it. Because, you know, with something this tiny and this different, and if we don't see the original picture, it's kind of hard to tell what part we cut off with his hand. So we're going to bring this down about here. You don't have to do it any more than where his hand actually is. And we're going to bring it back up here. And there we go. So when we bring it back, and we see we've got his hand completely in there. And then all we got to do is hit delete, and now it looks as though his hand is wrapped around that part. Look at that. Somehow, I don't know, that must have been sheer coincidence that I put that shadow right there. I'm actually going to really quick just emphasize that shadow a little bit more. I'm going to come in here with the dodge tool. This is really good for touch-ups, I guess is what I should say. The burn tool is really good for touching up shadows like that. but not for like, not always for the initial shadow. So look at that. I'm gonna a little bit more. And now check that out. It looks like he's got his hand wrapped around the back there. And we're gonna do the same thing with the tail over here. So we're just gonna take that out, you know, minimize that, make it visible, and we're gonna cut this piece out right along the edge, at least where it's important. We're gonna bring this back in, and once again we're gonna hit delete, and once again we've created the illusion that he's going behind some stuff. So now we've got our character like this. Now, I kind of think he's a little too brightly lit, especially for his legs. So, that's another good thing about the dodge tool is you don't have to worry about coloring outside the line. It's only affecting the areas that are there. So we're gonna just really quickly brush over his legs like this, make them a little bit darker, make it a little bit darker around this edge here, and if we feel like the lightness and the darkness don't have a proper balance between each other, we can do a little bit of brightness contrast here. And another thing I want to do is I want to go into color balance. These are all touch-ups. These are all things that are optional only if it doesn't look quite right. So highlights, I want to just be a tiny bit yellow. Maybe a little bit yellowish orange. Shadows. Our shadows look pretty bluish, reddish. Let's say bluish. Maybe just keep looking and see what works with it. I would say that looks pretty nice. And then one last thing we have to do, which could be optional or not, you know, depending on how you feel about it, we're going to go and we're going to add some noise to this. We're not going to do it like that. Yeesh. We're going to select something. It's about the same. Oh boy. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to select that very shape and we're going to fill it in. Now you know what? We're not going to do that. Here, let's... crap. Technical difficulties. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to duplicate... Hold on. We're going to duplicate this layer right here, and we're going to apply the noise filter to that. Luckily you get a preview here, and we want it to be something like that. Now we could just do this. When you lower the amount, you can see it also lowers, you know, the amount of noise that you're actually seeing. And we could do this to the original, but if we screw up with the original, you know, that sucks. So we make a second copy so that we can work with that one and see, is that the right amount of noise am I adding here? Okay, I'm gonna take this out and we're gonna look at just this. That looks like the right amount of noise. Maybe a little bit less. Hold on. If we take down the opacity here, it's almost as if like we're taking down that amount of noise. And then we're going to merge those two now that we've got the right amount of noise. And then we're going to see if we can't change the resolution of this. You know what, that might actually just be fine the way it is, because I think the resolution of the picture overall is that way. So here you go. If your opinion this isn't the best, it might not be. This might not be as good as my other ones. It might even be better. I don't know. Um, but overall, what I've told you is the technique I use for this. So that's all 3 videos. I'm going to put a link to the other 2 where I first taught you how to do shading and highlighting in the general basic, how to apply that to a character, and then finally how to apply that to a character in a sort of compositing effect to make it look like they are in real space. So I hope you enjoyed these videos. I hope it's helpful. This is my first series of videos, my tutorial videos. I've never done tutorial videos before. I just wanted to give it a shot. Thought maybe this might be helpful for people, but